Hello everyone, this is Shanko and welcome to chapter 10 of the Spring tutorial for beginners. In the previous chapter, we talked about the Spring web module and we created a REST API using the Spring web module. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about the Spring AOP module. So in this chapter, I'm going to follow a bottom-up approach. So first, we're going to see a demo for Spring AOP. I'm going to take a look at a project that uses Spring AOP. And after we're done with the demo, after we're done with having a walkthrough of the project, we take a look at the concepts or the theory surrounding or revolving around Spring AOP module, right? So for every application has certain functionalities that are common across multiple classes and that are common across multiple components and that are common across multiple applications or projects, right? And one of them is logging. So every time we are creating a project, we need to provide relevant loggers at places so that we are able to track the flow of data in our application, right? So basically what we are trying to do is we are trying to decouple the logging functionality and put it in one place that is outside the project or that is outside the component that holds the code for the business logic, right? So we have the business logic code in one project and we decouple the logging concern or the logging functionality into a separate project, and we plug in the logging functionality into the project that contains our business code, right? So for the demo, I've already created these two projects, REST API demo. So this is the project that we have already used in the previous chapter. We had already created this project in the previous chapter where we created a REST API using Spring web module. And for this project, for this demo, I have created this project, Spring AOP demo. So all our logging code or our logging functionality is placed inside this project, and this project has been included as a dependency inside this project REST API demo, right? So let's first take a look at this project Spring AOP demo, and let's go inside the form and look at the dependencies for this project. So we have the Spring Boot starter project that would add the basic Spring core dependencies into this project, and then we have Spring context support, Spring AOP, aspect J, RT, aspect J beaver. So these are for the AOP dependency, right? And then we have Spring Boot dev tools. So every time we make a save, it's gonna restart the server for us. And then we have log4j. So this would be used for logging, right? So those are the dependencies we have inside this project Spring AOP demo. Now let's take a look at the classes inside this project. So first up, we have this class that has the main method, right? And this is basically the entry point for our application or for this project. And we have Spring Boot application annotated on top of this class, so that makes this class a Spring Boot application. And apart from that, we also have this enable aspect J auto proxy, right? So this is going to enable the aspect J auto proxy or the AOP functionality for our project, right? And inside this package com.crosscutting dot logging, we have the logging aspect, right? So this class has aspect annotated on top of it, and this is also a component, right? So in a later part of this chapter, we'll see what an aspect is, but for the time being, let's just understand that this class is an aspect, right? And that is why we have this aspect annotated on top of this class, and we already know what component is. So component basically means that this class is included as a bean inside the Spring application context, right? And inside this class we have these methods: before log before all methods, log after all methods, log after normal return, all methods, right? And then log after exception, return all methods, right? And we have this annotation here at the rate before, and we have execution. We have some kind of command or some kind of statement or pattern that has been described, that has been defined here, right? And inside this we are just inside this method we are just logging some info, right? And that is basically it for this project, and we'll try to understand this project better at a later point in time in this chapter. Let's first take a look at this project, REST API demo, and I'll just say close all, and let's just go inside the POM and look at the dependencies for this project. So we can see we have this Spring AOP demo, which is essentially this project, Spring AOP demo, added as a dependency into this project, right? So basically what we are trying to do is we are trying to separate the logging functionality into a different project, and we are trying to plug it into this project, or we could have plugged it into multiple projects, right? So we have this Spring AOP demo inside the dependencies of this project, and apart from that we have Spring Boot Starter Web. So that is going to make this application a web application, and we have already taken a look at these dependencies in our previous chapter. So we have Spring Boot Starter Web, we have Spring Boot Dev Tools, Spring Boot Starter Test, Actuator, OJDBC. So that is going to help us connect to the database, which is essentially an Oracle server, Oracle database that we're trying to connect to. And apart from that, we have Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, right? So let's first take a look at this class. So we have this annotation @component scan, and inside this we are saying com.rest.api and com.crosscutting, right? So if we open up this project, we can see we have this kind of a base package structure, right? com.crosscutting, and here we have com.crosscutting.logging, right? So essentially what we're trying to do here is we are telling Spring to scan for components inside these base packages, right? So com.rest.api belongs to this project. So we have com.rest.api, and then we have controller, DAO, exception, model, service, and tutor, right? So it'll scan for components inside all these projects that start with com.rest.api, right? And it is also going to search for components inside these base packages, or this base package, right? com.crosscutting. So it's going to sort. It is going to look for components inside all the packages that begin with com.crosscutting, right? So we have com.crosscutting, and inside this we have this package. We have this class Spring AOP demo application, right? Which is essentially a component because we have this annotation Spring Boot application on top of it, right? And then we have logging aspect, which we have defined as component, right? So when we run this application, we have this application added inside this application REST API demo as a dependency, right? So we already have these classes. We already have this class Spring AOP demo application.java and logging aspect.java inside this class, inside this project, right? Added as a dependency inside the POM, right? And we are telling Spring that if you find packages which start with com.crosscutting or com.rest.api, then you should be searching for components inside these packages. So it'll, while creating the application context, or while loading the application context for this project REST API demo, it'll also load these classes as beans inside the application context for this project, right? REST API demo. So that is why we have mentioned @component scan on top of this class, right? And this is essentially the entry point for our application, for this application REST API demo, right? And apart from that, we have the basic things, controller. So inside this controller, we have already seen this controller in our previous chapter, right? In a previous chapter where we tried to build a REST API using Spring Web module, right? So we have already seen these classes. So what we are doing is we are trying to validate here. We are trying to validate this user, and if the user is not valid, basically this method would try to save a user into the database. So this API is, or this endpoint save is supposed to receive a user as the body of the post method, right? And if the user is invalid, it is not log an error into the log file, and it's going to throw an exception, a missing data exception, which is a custom exception that we have created, right? So that is basically it for this controller class. And apart from that, we have the DAO. So we have already talked about this class in our previous chapter. And apart from that, we have the centralized exception handler, which we have already seen in our previous chapter. We have the missing data exception. So these remain unchanged, right? These classes remain unchanged. We have the model classes, and we have the service layer here, where we have injected a DAO layer, or a repository, user repository. So we'll be using Spring Data JPA to fetch the records from our database and to interact basically with our database, right? And we have this util package, inside which we have the validators, right? So that is basically it, and these classes we have already seen in our previous chapter, right? And apart from that, let's just go into this project Spring AOP demo and take a look at the properties file inside the resources folder, right? So we have this application.properties, and inside this we have logging.config, right? So Spring Boot allows us to have a logging configuration file inside our class path, and we can just configure it this way. We can just load it this way with the help of this property logging.config, right? And we have mentioned the path for our logging configuration file, right? So the name of our logging file, logging configuration file is logback.xml, and it's included inside the class path because it is inside the resources folder, and that is exactly what we have mentioned here, right? Now let's take a look at the logback.xml file. So it basically has a configuration for the loggers that we're going to set, right? And this is a console appender. So whatever we find on the console, printed on the console, is going to be controlled by this configuration. And then we have the rolling file appender. So this is going to create a log file for our application, and this part holds the configuration for that. And we have set the logging level to error. So that is essential, that is what you would most probably be having in your production. So most often than not, you would want to set the logging level at production to error, so that not many logs are generated, and only the required ones, or the mandatory or the essential ones, are generated. So we have set the logging level to error, right? And we are using both the rolling file appender and the console appender, right? So we're going to print both to the file as well as to the console, right? And all of this logging thing, all of the logging functionality is separated from our REST API demo application, right? So REST API demo application holds our business logic or our business code, right? And logging functionality is not a business code, but it is an essential part, or it is an integral part of our application, right? And we have separated that functionality, or we have separated, we have decoupled that functionality and put it inside a separate application. And this application can be added as a dependency in multiple applications where we need the logging functionality, right? So that is basically it. And apart from that, we also have the application.properties file inside this REST API demo project. So here we have the configuration for the data source and for Hibernate, and we have the application running on 8283. So the application would be running on 8283, and we have also set the name for the application, right? Now let's try to close all of this and let's just try to run this. So I would say run as Spring Boot app. And this application, or this, if we go inside the controller, if we go inside the user controller class of this project, we can see we are exposing an endpoint which is essentially a REST, which is essentially exposed as a REST API. So we have this /API/v1, and we have the endpoints as /save and /fetch, right? So these are the two endpoints that we have for our REST API, right? And using /save, what we are trying to do is we are trying to save a user into the database, and while trying to save a user into the database, we are validating if the fields are correct or not, or if all the fields inside the user are present or not, right? And if the user if the incoming request is incorrect, we are trying to throw an exception, and we are also logging something. We are logging a message into our log file, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Postman to test the application, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the save endpoint, and what we are trying to do here is we have provided the username, we have provided the password, but the user, if we take a look at the user class, apart from the username and password, we also need to provide the first name and last name, right? And when we're trying to save a user into the database, this validator is being used, right? And if we go inside this is valid method, or if we go inside this implementation of is valid, it checks if the user first name and the user last name are present or not, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to intentionally send a request that is incorrect, right? I'm going to say for username, I'm just going to give some random username, right? And we have the password, but we don't have the first name and last name in our request body, right? And let's click on send. So this should be an error because the request body is incorrect, and our API throws an exception, or our API returns a bad request status, right? And we have the data here. Some of the mandatory fields are missing. Please verify and resubmit. And inside the error section, we have the error code as 400 and the reason mandatory fields missing, right? Now let's take a look at our console and see what got printed. So we have this message here, some mandatory data for the user is missing, please verify and resubmit. So that is being printed because of this, right? We have this we have this message being printed from here, and the next thing that we have is response entity com.rest.api.controller.user.controller.save user through an exception, right? So this is being printed from this class, or this aspect that we have provided here. So inside this method, after log after exception method, right, we have printed this. through an exception. So what we have done is join point dot get signature through an exception. So this is the signature of the class that threw an exception, or the component that threw an exception, which is essentially a method save user, which is defined inside the user controller class, right? This method that we're talking about, and threw an exception. So this message is basically printed from some other project that we have included as a dependency into this project, right? So that is basically how. And apart from this, we also have, if you refresh this, we also can see that this folder called logs got generated, and inside this we have this app logger.log file, right? And if we refresh this, we'll be getting our logs inside this file as well, right? So we have two error logs being printed. So we have this message, some mandatory data for the user is missing, please verify and resubmit. And then we have this response entity rest.api.controller.user save user through an exception, right? So basically we have all this configured inside another project, and we have all this configuration inside this logback.xml, right? So here what we are doing is we have this rolling file appender, and inside this we have set. So first we have set this property called logs, and the value is ./log. So this would create this folder called logs that we can see here inside this project. So we have this logs folder generated here, and after that we have this app logger.log file that we have configured here, and that got generated here inside the logs folder, right? So that is basically how we can separate our cross-cutting concerns, or the functionalities that we need across multiple components and multiple classes, multiple projects, multiple applications, and separate them into a different project and plug them in as a dependency into the projects that need those kind of functionality. So now that we have seen how Spring AOP works, let's take a look at some of the concepts and some of the theory revolving around the Spring AOP module, right? So these are some of the important terms that we have for Spring AOP. So the first one is aspect, which is essentially a module which has a set of APIs providing cross-cutting requirements. For example, a logging module would be called AOP, aspect for logging. An application can have any number of aspects depending on the requirement, right? So we have already seen at the beginning that we have this class annotated as an aspect, right? So this is basically an aspect, and we have separated, or we have decoupled the logging aspect into this component, right, that we have here, or this class that we have here. So that class is basically a set that provides a set of APIs, that just provides a set of methods for providing cross-cutting concerns, right? And then we have this term called join point. So this represents a point in your application where you can plug in AOP aspect. You can also say it is the actual place in the application where an action will be taken using Spring AOP framework. So basically a join point is the place where we are trying to plug in an AOP functionality, or cross-cutting functionality. So we can see we have this expression here, or we have this pattern defined here, com.rest.api.controller.user.save-user. So that is basically an expression to this method that we have inside user controller class, right? So we can see that we have the packages com.rest.api.controller, and the name of the class is user controller, and the name of the method is save user. So that is exactly what we have here, right? So this is essentially a join point or a place where we can plug in a functionality, a cross-cutting functionality. So this user controller method is a join point or a place where we want to plug in the functionality of logging, right? So that is basically a join point. And apart from that, we have advice. So this is the actual action to be taken either before or after the method execution. This is the actual piece of code that is invoked during program execution by Spring AOP framework. So basically, advice is the functionality, or advice is the cross-cutting concern that we are trying to cater to, that we are trying to provide, right? So here we have the advice set as before. So before entering this method or before executing this join point, this advice of logging is supposed to be plugged in, right? So we have different kinds of advices. We have before advice, we have after advice, we have after returning advice, and we have after throwing advice, and there's one more advice after around advice, right? So before basically means I mean, it is very easily understandable. These annotations are really easily understandable, and it is a literal meaning of what it actually does, right? So before basically means that before this join point or before this method is executed, this functionality is supposed to be plugged in. So the functionality here is of logging, right? So before this method is executed, the logging functionality is supposed to be plugged in. And here we have join point.get signature. So that's going to print the signature for this method, right? And the logger level is set to info here. So it is logging at info level. So if we have our info loggers turned on, these logs will get generated in a log file, right? And also in a console, as we have configured both of those in our configuration file, logging configuration file, right? So apart from that, we have after advice. So this would be executed after the join point has gotten executed. So after the method has gotten executed, this advice would get executed. After returning means whenever a method is successfully executed, then this advice would get executed. And after throwing means whenever a method throws an exception, this advice would be executed, right? So apart from that, we also have this point cut. This is a set of one or more join points where an advice should be executed. You can specify point cuts using expressions or patterns, as we'll see in our AOP examples. So we have already seen this example, and basically this expression that we have written here is called a point cut. So a point cut is an expression to define the join points where we want to plug in our functionalities, our AOP functionalities, or our cross-cutting concerns, right? So through this expression, we are trying to tell that we want our logging functionality to be injected or to be plugged in before this method is executed, right? So that is basically a point cut. And we have multiple types of advices. So before advice is one, before the method execution, after advice is one, after the method execution, regardless of its outcome. So even if it throws an exception or if it returns successfully, it is one. The after advice is one. After returning is executed only if the method completes successfully. So if after returning would only be executed if the method successfully returns, and after throwing is executed only if the method throws an exception. And around advice run before and after the advice method is invoked, right? So that those are the types of advices that we have for AOP. So Now let's take a look at the definition of AOP and let's see what AOP is all about. So we have already seen AOP in action, we already have an idea of what AOP is, right? Now let's take a look at the definition of AOP. So what is AOP? Spring AOP enables aspect-oriented programming in Spring applications. In AOP, aspects enable the modularization of concerns such as transaction management, logging, or security that cut across multiple classes and methods, often termed as cross-cutting concerns. AOP provides a way to dynamically add the cross-cutting concerns before, after, or around the actual logic using simple pluggable configurations. It makes code easy to maintain by separating the business code from the aspect code. So here in the example or in the demo that we saw, we had a functionality, or we had a concern for logging, and we plugged it into this REST API demo, which essentially had our business code or business logic into it, and we separated the cross-cutting concern of logging into a different project, and through that project we achieved the functionality of logging into another project, right? And we could have used this project, we could have used the logging aspect, or we could have used the AOP project in multiple projects, and we need not have written the same code again and again, right? So that is basically all about AOP. And in the next chapter, we're going to take a look at Spring Data and build a project where we use Spring Data and see the uses of it. So stay tuned and thanks for watching.